first want to thank all the organizers for arranging this panel. And I just want to start off by saying that this talk I've divided into 3 parts. So I'm just going to jump right into it because I'm really excited to share this new body of work. So step 1, an existential knowing. So what is the estro world? Well, I can tell you that it's a hyper object that is very, very difficult to perceive. I can also tell you that living in the estro world means that we all live under a double trauma. And what I mean by this double trauma is that firstly, we live in a profoundly polluted world that is colonized by hormonal molecules. That's the first trauma. The second trauma comes through this purity ideology that has paralyzed us into a state of fear that is both individualizing and decollectivizing. So it's a trap of the estro world that we all are caught in. So this is the double trauma. And I want to say that through biohacking, the estro world was revealed to me, and it's also the way we find a way out. So just to kind of zoom into what's happening on the molecular level, this is what I like to call the molecular semiosphere, the communication that happens between receptors and molecules. So in this green molecule, this is the estrogen receptor. Scientists call this receptor highly promiscuous, which means that it's a lock that has many keys. So all of these residues of industrial capitalism, we never intended to be communicating to our receptors, but they do. That's one of the big paradoxes of living in the Anthropocene. Scientists have also called this receptor highly conserved among all animal taxa. So if you think about this ancient organism that we all evolved from that first had a vertebrae, and think about all the species that evolved after this one ancient organism. So we all share the same estrogen receptor. So this is an incredible shared species vulnerability when we talk about living in the estro world. So I started Open Source Estrogen in 2015. And one of the main questions I was interested in is, how is gender codified by molecules? How did we arrive at this black box fact that estrogen codes for femininity and testosterone codes for masculinity? And as I've researched further on, it became clear to me that these molecules are already all around us in a state of pervasive toxicity. So I was framing this as a molecular colonization because I want to pose the question of, well, then how do we decolonize ourselves, our bodies, our environments, and the planetary? What does that mean? And so I started on this quest of hormone hacking. So some people have called it freak science, estrogen geeking, but the term that I probably align myself most with is public amateurism, which is a phrase from Claire Pentecost, an artist and a writer. And she describes it as the process of learning and doing and failing in the public sphere, and kind of removing the hierarchy of the layperson and the expert. I think it's really incredible what happens in these hormone hacking workshops, because you have this process of, co-generative play and jamming, all of these messy situations emerge that are really counter-analogous to these sterile white spaces of the laboratory. And if you think about what's another sterile white space is also the gallery or the museum. So in this kind of critical space of knowledge production that's happening in these hacking workshops, we are basically setting up these these critical spaces that are going against the status quo, that are queering the status quo. And that's why I see something so inherently political about biohacking, because it is, again, producing this existential knowing that is divested from institutions and these fictions, right, that define a living in the estro world. Again, going back to this trap that we're all caught in. So this is a 6-point plan for hormone queering resistance. It's very long, but it took me 3 years after Open Source Estrogen to really write this plan, because in the beginning, you're producing this existential knowing, and it really takes time to really integrate what that means. So step 1 is about this kind of excavation. And Antonia presented some really great examples of this type of excavation, where we're revealing we're making visible these molecular lines of biopower, of toxicity, hormone biopolitics. So that's like very much about excavation. And then step 2, promoting amateur exploration. Step 3, resisting the profiteering of non-consenting bodies and environments. I think the work of Danny Admis is very much into this collectivization in order to resist these power structures. And then we get to, step 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so I think this is where biohacking starts to cross this very critical threshold of, okay, so like now we know that there are these scandalous levels of estrogen in the water supply. Now we know that, what's inside of our bodies is an unruly composition of both synthetic and organic materials, right? So we are all multiply composed. So the question is, what do we do now after gaining this existential knowing? How do we live, cope, and care in this permanently polluted world? So what are these strategies for belonging in the molecular semiosphere? So number 4, rejecting these definitions of normal and natural, techno-solutionism. Number 5, using queering to explore the multiverse of possibilities. And then I want to emphasize number 6, considering the microperformativity of hormones as an agential power of not just colonization, but also of collaboration. So, what do I mean by this? And that leads me to part 2 of this talk, alien tendencies I wish to no longer hide. So in my research, I come across a lot of these articles off the internet that really reflect back the kind of cultural panic that we are all experiencing when we are doing toxic discourse. So this is just a blog post from a random user of the internet. And just to summarize it, this person is saying, I don't think it's right that there are birth control pills in the water supply because it's making all the men gay. And we need both men and women to propagate the human species. And maybe we should talk about this more so than talking about people crossing our borders. Okay, so basically we have homophobia, transphobia, and xenophobia all in the same article on the topic of toxicities. And there's something really problematic about this, not just in this idea about, toxicities being very unevenly distributed, but also that our levels of empathy are unevenly distributed. There's this whole idea of, what bodies are worthy of living and which are worthy of dying, right, under the molecular semiosphere, under the estro world. And in the US, we have these medically accepted practices where intersex infants, when they're born with ambiguous genitalia, a doctor will perform a surgery to make the child male or female based on the genitals. And it's just based on these measurements, right? Like if the clitoris must be between 0 and 1 centimeters, and the penis must be between 2.5 and 4.5 centimeters. So who determines these numbers, right? Who determines the definitions of normal and natural? And how do you construct definitions for things that are in constant change? We are all living in an ever-changing world. So how do you put the world into categories? And when we talk about strategies, this image, I think, is very representative of the dominant strategy we see today, which is, let's just clean it up. Let's just clean up the toxicities, and let's try to barricade ourselves from further toxicities. So right here, like they're literally trying to like round up all the plastic, but actually they're just going to move it to another place and to pollute another region, right? And I think the last two talks were, we really talked about complicity, the nature of complicity, and this idea that, you know, even though we live here in Europe with access to clean air and clean water, it doesn't mean that we are not complicit in another region's unclean air and unclean water, right? So I'm trying to make us think beyond these notions of purity, and these notions of purity, they're not just in our discourses about toxicity, but they're very much rooted in the way that we define national borders, or the way that white supremacists are denying a racist colonial past, or even the way that Gen Z cultures just engaging or indulging in cancel culture. Right, it's the way that, you know, people react to birth control pills in the water supply with, you know, the fear of men feminizing. So these are all rooted in this binary thinking, this trap of the estro world that is very much based on a desire of purity. So why don't we think of strategies where we say that toxicity is the starting point? Plastic is the nature we seek to understand. Right? Because this is clearly not working. So that's why I started to think, okay, so if we start off saying that we are all already alien, we are all already queer, right? So I wrote this 3-step process for living in an increasingly queer world for people who have not accepted that yet. So step 1, toxicities. You live in an alien landscape that is colonized by hormones. Step 2, semiosis. You're already alien, and it's actually impossible to not be alien. And we discover this very much so when we do biohacking as a social material practice. And step 3, subjectivities, is asking you, do you want to be more alien than you already are? So this is, ever since I wrote this, it kind of became like my artist toolkit. You know, it's like this, this is the toolkit that I refer back to whenever I'm trying to think of a possible strategy. And even in this talk that I'm giving right now, I am using this 3-step process. So actually we're on step 2. I'm telling you how alien you already are. And part of this toolkit involves a very embodied strategy. So I started to use more performative strategies in my workshops when I started collaborating with the Aliens in Green, which is a tactical theater group that situates our planet as a laboratory. So through the Aliens in Green, it really became clear to me that biohacking as a social material practice is able to breed these new subjectivities by re-articulating present and past ontologies, right? So in this workshop, it looks a bit strange, but this is like, the workshops tend to be like 8 hours long, 10 hours long. And we make the participants do a bunch of these menial laborious tasks that are based in biohacking. And the idea is like we're trying to remix this kind of alien biocommons that we're all part of. You know, the idea that there is no fixity in our bodies. There is no fixity in our environments, but everything is in a constant state of recombination. So through this physical labor, everything becomes much more embodied, right? So biohacking is no longer just producing basic didactic knowledge or utilitarian knowledge, but it's becoming embodied experiential knowledge. And the whole point of these very long workshop performances that are 8 hours long, 10 hours long, is that we're trying to neutralize the fear and the panic. So we start off with this existential crisis, this feeling that your body has been stolen. And I see this reaction in a lot of my workshops working with participants, that it's always a feeling of powerlessness when we are talking about, how colonized we are by hormonal molecules. So I explored this more in a project called Molecular Queering Agency, which is another workshop performance that is a 10-person trauma releasing exercise. So I have ritualized a hormone extraction biohacking protocol. And the whole idea is to release the traumas of the estro world, this double trauma that I'm talking about. So I think that part of this release has to do with acknowledging the alien in us, the fact that our bodies are in constant change, the fact that our bodies are not as recalcitrant as we've always told them to be. We've been told that they are. So that leads us to part 3 of this talk, the genesis of caressing oceans. And now I will talk about this new performance workshop called Performing the Sublime Sea of Co-Mattering. So we arrive in a toxic site where toxicities have leaked across bodies, space, and time. And we start to scavenge for these intentionally alienated materials. And I think Heather Davis writes about this so well when she talks about plastic as a material that embodies all of the colonial logics of dislocation and dissociation. So if we look at plastic, it's been intentionally non-localized. Like it seems to appear out of nowhere, but it's existing everywhere, right? So this is the alienating characteristic of plastic. So we scavenge for these materials as a kind of like encounter, like we are just like arriving at this site and we are encountering the alienated qualities of this terraformed site. Then we bring all of our materials back to a venue and we perform a non-ocular sensing exercise. So we're putting on blindfolds and we're using touching as a form of hearing, as a form of smelling, as a form of tasting, as a form of seeing. And this is a very exhausting process because we are not used to sensing in the dark, right? And the reason why we do this is because so much of white Western cosmology of matter and mattering is based on this way of seeing. Right? I think Donna Haraway describes it so well when she talks about the God trick, that you believe it when you see it. So much of scientific thought is based on this ocular sensing. So we do a non-ocular sensing. And in this process, we're actually gaining a new intimacy with this alienated material. Like we're actually allowing our intimacy to spill over into the non-human or the extra-human. Then, step 3, we do a scenography building exercise. So I have only 2 rules for this exercise. The first rule is that you are not allowed to speak. So all of your negotiations with other people as you're constructing the scenography, it has to be done somatically. And then the second limitation is that you must build in your extractive devices. So before we do this exercise, I teach them all how to make a extraction device for hormones in the urine. So the reason why I do this is because we need these instruments and these devices to investigate this new world that we're building. So in this scenography building, it's actually, we're trying to go from the world ending to the world making. And after we've constructed this scenography, what we've achieved essentially is a new hyperspecificity. So going from a hyper object to a hyperspecificity, and how healing that can be. So I've done this workshop 3 times now. And what emerges from the scenography building is always a combination of a home, a garden, or a shrine, or a shelter. And so automatically you are trying to belong with these alienated materials, right? You are trying to find a sense of belonging. And it happens every time with all the participants I've worked with. So with this new hyperspecificity, I see it as a pleasurable breakage from the past, from these past ontologies of the estro world, from these binary ontologies. And then we invite a public audience to come and watch us perform in the scenography, which is the step 4 of this workshop performance. And I think performance is such a co-creative process, right? Like it's this co-creative process where you can just let go of all of these predetermined notions of normal and natural and ontological divisions. You can just let go of all of that, and you can engage in this co-creative process and just enter into the world genesis part, the world making part. So that's why I think this is such a crucial step to actually perform in this space that you've just created. And I did this performance most recently in the Rupert residency in Vilnius, Lithuania. And we had a very interesting site. It was a kind of rundown sewing factory called the Leah. And when we're talking about haunting and ghosts, this is really a space of where you can feel this like detritus of capitalism and like all of these failed dreams of like families who wanted to survive working in these factories, and all of these kind of toxic entanglements that came out of an industry like this. So here's all of the waste that we found on site. Right, a huge pile of waste. And here's us doing the non-ocular sensing exercise. And then here's us doing the scenography building. And then here we are doing the performance. And as you can see, we are doing the urine hormone extraction using our extraction devices. And when we do this, like we're actually just capturing like the tiniest snapshot of our toxic state of being in this macrocosmos of space and time, right? Like when you extract the hormones from the urine, it's really just like this very, very tiny snapshot in like this super long glitching process of our bodies and our environments. But maybe this is all we need, to transmute the traumas of the old world into the new. So to conclude this talk, I'm actually going to read a very short excerpt from a paper I wrote recently that will be published soon in a book called Synthetic Becoming. So in conclusion, biohacking reveals the estro world to us, and it also sends our way out. Through a collective interrogation of our socio-material reality, we re-articulate the purity ideologies of the estro world. We accept that all borders, even the barriers of our own skin, are really just transient spaces that are ultimately unable to wall off the leakiness of our toxic interrelations and toxic interdependence. We accept that generative worlds emerge with molecules, even if they have been deemed harmful and invasive. We accept that living in an endlessly shape-shifting world means also co-mattering in its accidents and mishaps over and over again. We release notions of dystopia and catastrophe that have paralyzed our ability to collectivize and to belong. Instead, we choose to stand in the fire and fear. We choose to stay entangled in order to transform. Thank you.